Strange Telenetwork, the go-to site for your infinite source of precise, reliable, and factual material exposing the Watchtower organization.
Well, everyone, thank you for coming in. This is our last program of the day. We have Jay Hess. He has a program he calls Making Disciples with Jay. You just heard him on the Christian Court program, and he's on here to answer questions. He's going to be answering some questions that you have written into the 6 screens, and I passed them off to Jay. So, Jay, I'm going to bring you on, and we're going to ask Jay to come up these questions and answer them. Hi, Jay.
Hey, Rick. Doing all right. Just a reminder, we are December 4th. Make sure that everyone that can show up in 2 weeks, so I know it's the holidays times, that it may be something you want to check with all the participants for 2 weeks.
Okay. So that'll be, okay, that's right around, all right, 2 weeks. Okay, we'll, I'll keep you up to speed on what's going on. I'll email you and let everyone know. But thank you for reminding me. I kind of forgot all about that. But that's wonderful. So I'm going to cut you loose. I'm here if you need me.
All right, Rick. All right, folks. I am Jay Hess, and formerly I was involved with the Watchtower until I was 40 years old, and I was involved with the writing department, and I was booted out because I was confessed to worshiping Jesus, which is, if you know about Jehovah's Witnesses, that's a serious crime. So I was found guilty, and I did not repent, so I'm out of that. All right. The show is driven by your questions. So if you've got questions, if you're on hooked by the hooked on using the phone at the phone number, which is 727-731-6701. And then when you come on, just if you have time to talk, you do *6, and we can hear you. Otherwise, if you found the YouTube link, you can type in your comments, and that's how you get into our show. So if you do have a question, in a moment, I'll just pause and you just *6, and then you politely say, "Hey, Jay, I've got a question or a comment." That's fine, and we'll go for it. Otherwise, I have some questions that have been given to me. Either last week, last time, 2 weeks ago, had some questions, and I've got some that were not answered last time, but now Rick has sent me some questions. Other people have sent me some questions, and I have a list. So that's what we do here. I am a retired pastor, elder of an evangelical church here in North Carolina, and I've been involved with mainstream Christianity for 30 years, and been a member of the Evangelical Theological Society for 25 years, so I get exposed to what the scholarly community is doing and want to share that with you. So that's why I'm here to answer your questions. One of the questions I'm going to do today is from last time about the God of the Old Testament. Seems like a rough character. Does the Old Testament ethics of God merge or even harmonize with the ethics of the New Testament of Jesus and what kind of person he was? So we're going to look into that. The question was given last time about it seems to be a conflict between the God of the Old and the God of the New. So that's one question. Another question is, if God knows what is going to happen, why was there a tree of knowledge? And what was that tree of knowledge about? And did God create evil? God created the devil, didn't he? Well, so did God create evil is our question. Missing books of the Bible, that's another question. We may not get time to answer all of that, but we are going to try and we're going to get into it. If you have any questions, though, we're going to pause now. If there's any lead-in questions to start this hour, we're just going to 6 p.m. Eastern. You just *6, unmute yourself, and say, "Hey, Jay, I got a question." Okay. No questions yet. So maybe people want to know our first question for the day, which is about the God of the Old Testament. Oh, here we got Absalom has got a question he's about to type in here. So we'll see what he has to say. He's on YouTube, and he's found the link. And I'm not seeing that question. Well, maybe we'll have to wait a bit. It's not popping up just yet. So I'm going to start in with the Canaanite. Are there salvation for psychopaths? You know, that's our question. We'll call that number one. Are there salvation, or is there salvation for psychopaths? Well, there are so many things we don't know that the Bible does not talk about. And I am not the judge. God is the judge. What about those that have something wrong going on in their brains, that they are driven by chemical imbalances, things that they certainly cannot control? God is the judge. We don't have a lot of details on such things, but because the Bible talks about more normal people, that their abilities, their mental abilities, emotional abilities are normal, and they look at life and they look at God's creation and can draw conclusions about that there's a God, or there's some force that created the universe. They encounter people and respond in ethical ways. Well, that's what the Bible addresses. But the concept of people that have something really weird going on, the Bible doesn't say. Sorry, I wish I had more of an answer, but the Bible doesn't say. So I say, let's leave it to God. We are called to show compassion as best as we can to other people. If they're dangerous, well, the Bible indicates in Matthew 10 that we may need to run the other way, get away from people that are nutty, or having other kinds of problems, of any kind of problem, and especially problems with violence. We may need to get out of the way. So it's not our place. We just let God be the judge, and we just pray for their rescue, their salvation, and that God shows them mercy. All right. Okay, that was our first question. Next question from last time about the Canaanite annihilation, when God let the Israelites, got them free out of Egypt, and he sent them to the promised land. There was a lot of death and destruction. If you read Genesis, you can read the first 5 books, but especially Numbers. There's some things in Deuteronomy, but if you get into Joshua and Judges, wow, there is a lot of killing of the Canaanites. Now, the question from last time reads like this: are you saying that the stoning of wrongdoers and killing entire tribes, including children, but keeping the virgins, was not contradictory to the New Testament? I think what this person is asking is, in the law, that those who are wrongdoers, who knew what the law was, who had promised to God not to do these things, and they're doing serious things like murder, or like spiritism, or like adultery and destroying marriages. The law required that the Jews who had already made the covenant with God, agreed to it, and knew the law. In fact, every Sabbath, every Saturday, they were required to rehearse it and study it and teach it to their children. They knew these laws. So they had promised to keep them, and yet they did these serious wrongdoings. They were stoned because they had no prison system. They had no judges. Well, they had judges, but they didn't have a police force. They didn't have a warden and a prison system. So people had promised not to do these things. They did them. These are serious crimes. The law said people who do this are to die. Now, what they could have done is they could have left the land, but they chose to stay, so they are stoned. Well, does this fit with the New Testament ethic? And I'm going to read some scriptures that will show God's ethics. But again, the question is about stoning wrongdoers. What about this killing entire tribes? Well, the killing of entire tribes was only in the case where there was a serious violation. If they were in a Jewish tribe, they didn't ever kill off an entire tribe. But normally this question is referring to Canaanite tribes. When God sent the Israelites to the promised land, they encountered other national groups. Now the Jews offered to say, let us just go through. We don't want any trouble. We're not going to fight. We just want to walk through. And these other nations would not allow these people just to pass peacefully through. So the Jews defended themselves. And God gave these other nations time to leave, time to back off, and told them, those that lived in the promised land, he warned them 40 years before this, before they actually went into the promised land. They had 40 years to back out. And if they wanted to stay in the land, they could, if they agreed to live peacefully with the Jews. But those that decided to stand, stay, and fight, well, God says they need to go. And these nations that were terrible nations that wanted to fight the Jews, and the way they got help in fighting the Jews, they would appeal to their gods and offer sacrifices of living children to those gods to get the support they needed to fight off the Jews. God said these people need to go. They could have run away, but they chose to stay. So, given that context, the question is, does that merge or match the New Testament ethics, the God of the New Testament? So, let's take a look. Luke 19, verses 14 and 27 is a parable that Jesus gives, and it's a parable about his own rulership and what his rulership will be. And if you go to Luke 19, it says in verse 14 that his citizens, meaning the Jews, hated him. And then in the metaphor of the parable, that his citizens hated this wealthy dignitary, and they sent a delegation to go to the headquarters and say to the real leader, which would be God, he says, we do not want this man to reign over us, which is what the Jews, in a sense, said. Well, verse 27 there, this is what Jesus said, speaking for himself. He says, but as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. So, if the simple question, does the ethics of the God of the New Testament match with the ethics of the God of the Old Testament? The answer is yes, it does. That's kind of a shocking thing to read, but those are Jesus' words, that those that do not want him, after you read about Jesus in, say, the Sermon on the Mount, what kind of leader he would be, what kind of king he would be, if someone says, oh no, I can't stand him, I don't want him to be king. Well, you see, the earth is going to be God's promised land. And those who do not want Jesus as king, after you read the Sermon on the Mount on what a wonderful king he would be, there's not going to be a place for such a person that doesn't want that. Thus, that does match the God of the Old Testament. Now, for a further answer, that was a short answer. There's a much longer answer, and that's in this book. It's entitled, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God by Paul Copan, Ph.D. So that's that book here. Let's see if I can hold it where the camera will pick that up. Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. So that is a good book. I've gone through the whole thing. I have a course on it. And it is all dedicated, 250 pages dedicated to answering this one question. And now I will say is that if the God of the Old Testament did not have the power of the resurrection and also was supreme in love, then, and especially in applying and dispensing the final judgment, If this God, if the God of the Old Testament is not that God, then the God of the Bible would be a monster. But because the God of the Old Testament has the power of the resurrection and can bring all people back and fix the situation. Now, are the people that are evil, that are enemies of God, that will face everlasting judgment? Yeah, there are, just as we read there in Luke 19. But because this God has all this power and knows how to dispense judgment rightly, equitably, and in love, that's why we say the God of the Bible is not a moral monster, but rather is a God who loved so much that he gave his only son, that whoever puts their trust in Jesus, or I would further say in the God of the Bible, they may not know his name, but if they know about God, if they've seen God in the universe, in creation, and says, wow, I sure wish I knew that God can show mercy to that person. All you have to do is read Matthew 25, beginning in verse 31, about the sheep and the goats, just to see how merciful God is. That is a God, a good God, and one that we can support, and that's the God of the Old Testament, and it is the God of the New Testament. They do not contradict each other, the New and the Old Testament. All right, that was as short as I could make it, even though my course was about some 40 hours long when I went through Paul Copan's book. All right, I'm going to pause there. And if someone has a question, you just *6 and say, hey, Jay, I've got a question or a comment. Or from YouTube.
Good afternoon, Jay.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. A friend of mine's asking me to ask you. He wants to know, where do good people go when they die, and what kind of a place is it? And conversely, where do bad people go when they die, and what kind of a place is it? Thank you, Jay.
Sure. There is a demarcation where that place changes at the time of the cross. Prior to the time of the cross, everyone who died went to a common place called Sheol. But as we read in Isaiah, the description of Sheol, it does appear that there are a couple different states within Sheol. Some say there's 2 compartments. I'm not entirely convinced of that. There's a passage in Luke 19 that was where Jesus gives a story, and he, if you compare that story in Luke 16 to what the Pharisees of the time believed, the Pharisees of Jesus' day believed that the place of Sheol was divided into compartments. And there was a good side and a bad side. I'm not convinced that Jesus was teaching it. I'm convinced, though, that Jesus was using it. And there could indeed be compartments, as based on, if you read, Isaiah chapter 19 or chapter 26, thereabout you get hints. I won't say it's certainly taught, but it does seem to suggest that there could be different kinds of states in Sheol. And elsewhere we might have hints of that. So, and that may be being brought out in Luke 16 in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. But whatever, prior to the cross, everyone went there, the good and the bad. It does seem that the good are resting. The bad, they might be troubled. There may be undergoing a punishment there in Sheol. There is a reference, or appears to be a reference to that in Jude. So that's before the cross. Not a lot of details there, but when you get to the New Testament after Christ, then there is a little bit more clarity. There is you could point to the parable of rich man and Lazarus, but that's still while Jesus was alive, and I think reflects on Old Testament situation. So for New Testament, we read in Hebrews chapter 12 I'm not going to go through the whole thing of Hebrews chapter 12, but if you start getting into the verses surrounding verse 23, you read that the writer speaks of Christians have approached, in a metaphorical, figurative way, the heavenly Mount Zion. And there, this writer of Hebrews lists all who are in or enrolled in the heavenly Jerusalem. So I'm going to read some of that. And if you're wondering about this, and you're reading in the New World Translation, set the New World Translation away, because the New World Translation deliberately changes the text. Technically, it's they change a dative noun into an adjective, and that doesn't make sense in Greek. But if you read in Hebrews 12, beginning in verse 18, about how Christians have figuratively, while alive, have approached a heavenly Mount Zion. But what we see there in that heavenly Mount Zion is listed there, beginning in verse 22. It's called the city of the living God. And there we find angels in a pleasant situation. That's verse 22. And 23 is the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. That's referring to Christians who are not yet in heaven, but they're enrolled in heaven. Then God is there, who is the judge of all. Then at the end of verse 23 are the spirits of the righteous, this is righteous people, who've been made perfect. Who are the spirits? How did they get to this heavenly Mount Zion? And their spirits, they're not resurrected, but there they are. How did they get there? Verse 24 says, who else is there? Jesus? Okay, so we have Jesus and the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So from that and other passages where Paul says that he would be with Christ, we reach the conclusion that at the time of the cross, in all likelihood, at the time of the cross, all those who are in Sheol, in the state where they have been faithful to their covenant to God or worthy of a removal from Sheol into the heavenly Mount Zion. There's a verse in Ephesians we might look at that seems to suggest such a thing, but it's debated. But I'd say that from these other verses, but especially Hebrews 12:23, that there are spirits, and these would be spirits of those that were counted worthy in their life, worthy because of their faith in God, faith in what little they knew of the true God of the Bible. They have been granted entrance into the heavenly Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, and there they wait. And this is again probably a carryover from what they were doing in Sheol, and when they're in Sheol, is that they're resting in a peaceful environment. How much they're aware of their environment, we don't honestly know. From Isaiah, it does seem that they are somewhat aware, or that they can be made aware of what's going on in Sheol. So we would expect that something similar, if the writer of Hebrews describes this place of angels, Jesus, God, that maybe there's some limited awareness of what's going on. We don't really know how much they are aware, but it's a place of peace and rest. I know that was long, but I wanted to point out at least a couple scriptures so that you would have something to rely on in answering this fellow. That, yeah, it's not a lot said in Scripture, but there are hints in places. A couple in Isaiah, one in Hebrews 12, another in Philippians, where Paul says that he would pass, he would face death, but then he would go to be with Christ. Hope that works. Or if you have any further questions, just *6 and unmute yourself and say you've got a question or a comment. Okay. Going to move on to our next question. If God knows what is going to happen, why did he put the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden? Well, putting a tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden is not about what God knows. It's what he's testing humans with. So I'm going to mention a little bit of the scriptures that speak of the tree of knowledge so that we can talk about that, what that means. Genesis 2:9, verses 16 through 17, and Genesis 3:6 and 22. So we'll go read that. 2:9 says, "And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. And here we go, the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So it wasn't just the knowledge of everything. It was a knowledge of what is good and what is evil. Okay, we don't want to forget that. Genesis 2 again mentions God giving the command. This is chapter 2, 16 and 17. God says that man can eat of any tree, but he says that the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. On that day you shall surely die. Then Genesis 3, we know that the woman was tempted to eat of the tree. Verse 6 says she saw it was good, looked good to her. It was a delight to the eyes, something that would make her wise, she thought. So she took and ate it and then gave it to her husband, and at some point and he ate it too. Well, we see the consequences in verse 22. Then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has come like one of us." So God is talking to somebody else. I think it's likely this is the Son of God. And he says, man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take the tree of life and live forever. So that offer of life was there. But choosing to decide what was good and evil, independent of God, bad idea. So God says, don't do this. Don't eat of this tree that we're calling the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of it, what are you showing? That you're disobeying God. You're choosing your own path of what you think is good and bad. And if you do that, that will lead to death. And so what God does is he puts man out of that garden, unplugs him from that which gives life, because that's what's inside the garden is the tree of life. And he puts them out of the garden, and thus they are on a path to death. So that's really what that tree means. Now, God does know what's going to happen, but I believe he still gives man free will. So knowing God knowing what was going to happen, put this test before man. And they choose what God knows they are going to choose, but it's a test, and it's also a image and drama of what all humans will generally face in their time. Every human faces, I believe, people that grow up are certainly of a mind that works, make choices of what is right, what is wrong, and what they're going to do. And in those choices, are they seeking God? Are they seeking better advice than depending upon their own choices? Well, God knows that humans will make those poor choices. But Adam and Eve were perfect. They had full information. They had full counsel from God, and yet they freely chose a path that was contrary to God's advice. This is something that we all humans, other than we're not perfect like Adam and Eve, and we did not have perfect communication with God. We do not have direct communication with God. But what do we do in our situations? Do we stop and wonder? Do we think using our conscience, or do we let our egos make the choice, our personal pleasure make the choice? Or do we wish that we had better advice? Do we ask and think about it into our conscience? Do we ponder it and say, what is right here? What is wrong? You see, if we stop and question our conscience and say, maybe I shouldn't do this, you have just shown yourself to be different from Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve did not pause when they had God's advice. They went straight ahead and disobeyed. What about you? What about everyone that has ever lived after Adam and Eve? When faced with a choice, did they prefer their seeking of pleasure and happiness? Or did they stop and say, what is the ethical thing to do? You see, all humans are made in God's image. Now, because of the fall, there's imperfection, there's other things going on, there's psychopaths. There's psychopaths. That's a tough one for someone who's disabled in the brain. But everyone else gets a chance to be in the place of Adam and Eve, to be faced with choices. And do they stop and say, is this right? What does my conscience tell me? Now, Romans chapter 2 mentions this, that everyone that can question their conscience, and questioning your conscience is a good thing. It's what God is looking for you to do. Do you question your conscience and say, what is the right thing to do? If you are questioning your conscience, wanting to make a wise choice, seeking a wise choice, you are showing that you are different and choosing a different path from Adam and Eve. God is looking for that. God is looking for you. But for someone that does not stop to ask their conscience, ponder this, pause, then they are not being different from Adam and Eve, but following the same kind of path. Those kind of persons are at risk, and they will face a judge, and it'll be up to God, Jesus specifically, Jesus to judge that person. And I'm not that judge. So Jesus will make that choice, make that decision. But the average person who has a conscience, who has been made in the image of God, can stop and pause and say, what is the right thing to do? Now, God can make those. God is free to make choices. Jesus is, the Holy Spirit is. So they have the knowledge of good and evil. We humans must slow down, restrain ourselves, and instead of just making that decision of what we think is right and wrong, stop, take a pause, ask ourselves, does my conscience scream at me and tell me that this is wrong? Then I need to listen. And thus we show that we are children of God, not children of Adam and Eve. And thus, if we're followers of Adam and Eve and choose to ignore God's warning, then our path leads to death. Now, just a final comment is that the only other alternative is for God to have implanted in us instincts like he does for animals. And animals are not accountable because of their choices. Rather, they are considered innocent. That's why animals were suitable sacrifices for the guilty, because animals are not violating God's law. They follow their instinct. But then if we had these implanted instincts, then we would not be made in the image of God, would we? We would be in the image of animals. And if we had instincts, that's true, we wouldn't make the mistakes, because everything we follow in our instincts would be what God wanted us to do. But then we couldn't make choices to worship God, to seek God, to want God. and to make ethical choices to learn from God on how to behave. So, therefore, God, making us in his image, gave us that freedom and ability to make ethical choices and hopefully to seek God. And Hebrews 11:6 says that we must be seekers of God. And then at judgment, we will face the judge, Jesus. And I hope and pray that for those who don't really know Jesus, they lived at the wrong time in the wrong place, or have medical conditions that make it impossible for them to really listen to a conscience, or they're like little children, that God will show mercy. And when we get to the kingdom, we will find out just what that means. All right. So I think that answers that question. So I'm going to take a pause, and if someone has an answer or a comment or a question, just *6 and say, "Hey Jay, I've got a question here." All right, we'll pause a bit. Okay. Next question. Since God created Satan, can it be said that God created evil? Well, that would seem like that must mean God created evil, because the devil he's the embodiment of evil, isn't he? So, God created everything. God created the devil, so God created evil. Well, I want to stop and think about the question: what does it mean to create evil? What is evil? Well, the answer is that any ethical choice that conflicts with what our eternal perfect creator says is right, that would be evil. So if being different from God is, or making an ethical choice different from God is evil, then if God created some entity that could make a different choice, then that's on that creature that God created. God didn't create that entity, in this case the devil or some angel, with the being compelled to do evil. There's no indication that God created entities that would be compelled, right from creation, compelled to disobey God. Rather, they had the free choice to disobey God. Some obeyed in heaven, some disobeyed. God's first human creation got a warning, but they were able to freely make a choice. I believe they had that free choice, and they chose against God's intent and God's warning. Thus, they did evil, as well as the devil, whom we call the devil or Satan. He too made that contradictory choice. So it does go back to the previous question: is that the only way to avoid that is to make everyone instinctive? But God gave this angel, and not just one, but all of them, that ability to make a free choice. And I'm glad, because I like the ability to freely choose things and to be made in God's image. I like that. I prefer that. But I also believe that I have a responsibility to stop and think and question my own conscience. I believe that all have a free choice, and God does not force anyone to choose evil. So therefore, God did not create evil. He only created living things that had the ability to freely choose to either go and cooperate with what God said and wants, or choose a different path. And will lead to death, because only God knows life. And we who are trying to follow life and follow based on experience, that's a really dumb choice, because we don't know the future. We can't see the future. And God can see to eternity and can tell us, this is a dumb choice. You'll end up dead. Don't do this. And we should ponder and go, okay, yeah, that's really dumb. And we want to be different from Adam and Eve, who left God and therefore kicked out of the garden, and therefore were not seeking God. They didn't go back and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, God, please come back. Let me in because I only want to live by your commands." That's not what they did. But we are in a situation like Adam and Eve, in a position where we can freely choose to seek God, according to Hebrews 11:6. Freely choose God, according to Acts 17, round about verse 30. To freely choose, and in Acts 17, Paul used the term to grope, which is a kind of seeking. We can do that, and when we do that, we are showing that we are not our parents, Adam and Eve, but we are seeking God. And even though we don't have clear messages, direct messages for sure, and our messages come through the Bible, they're through translations, possibly through other sources of information, looking at creation or persons that God is using to warn us. That communication is not the clearest, it's not perfect, but are we seekers? And that's my question. Anyone hears this? Are you a seeker? Are you at the least interested in guidance toward life, not just in this present existence, but with the hope that there is a better world than this? What have you got to lose? I have found this path of seeking God is better than any other path I could have chosen. I have a better quality of life than anything else I could have chosen. And I'm not denied joy. I'm not denied peace. I have found peace, and I'm convinced that this is the only way I would have peace. Why would I not want it? Especially when there is a promise of life in God's kingdom, which we call heaven, but I believe also includes earth. Okay, I think that that covers that question. I'm going to pause there to see if anyone else who is on YouTube wants to type in a question or call in the phone number there, and then *6 to unmute yourself, and then say, "Hey Jay, I've got a comment," or "Hey Jay, I've got a question," and ask your question. We'll pause for a minute. Okay. All right. Next question. The question is, why are some books included in the Bible, but some are not? I'm going to try and make that a short answer. I'm going to give some basic guidelines to explain why. There's a couple answers why some were included and some were not. Of the books that we have that say were found in the Dead Sea Scroll collection, or books that have been preserved through Jews through the centuries, especially prior to the time of Christ, or books or Christian books that have been preserved after the cross, scholars look at those books, and there's certain criteria that they use to measure, does this belong in what we call the canon? That means the standard books of the Bible, which we count to be 66. Now, there's plenty of good things you can read outside of the Bible. You can read a good math book. That's all true. But we're talking about biblical books or guides in life of how to have good relationships with others and how to seek God. So for those books, how do scholars choose that? Well, we rely upon things that the Jews preserved. And of those books that the Jews preserved, we find them in the Dead Sea Scroll collection that started 300 BC. Most of those books that we consider to be biblical books are referenced or quoted or alluded to in the New Testament. Just in the books of Luke and Acts, all written by Luke, we see references or allusions, what we call allusions or references, to most of the Old Testament books. All but 3 are hinted at there in just the books, Luke and Acts. Those books tell us that those are likely books that would be received as authoritative, as inspired, and they were, as I said, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the books that the Jews accepted up to the time of Christ, and there are hints even in the New Testament of what those books are, but also the Jews have preserved what those books are. Those are the ones we accept as belonging to the canon or standard. For the New Testament books, it's books that were authored and or endorsed by those who knew Christ. So the apostles, the books that they wrote or had secretaries write, or ministry partners that they knew write, and those that were accepted in that early Christian community as endorsed by Bible writers. That is nearly all the books of the New Testament. There's some we're not absolutely sure, like the book of Hebrews, but it was written at a time while Timothy was alive, and we suspect that also the Apostle John was alive at the very least, and the book of Hebrews was preserved. So those books we put into the canon. I'm going to further note on the Old Testament books. These Old Testament books that we include in the canon that the Jews accepted, there's something special about most of those books. They all have the divine name written in them. The YHWH, I would pronounce that Yahweh. Those books are the name is there on almost every page of those books, except for 3 books. They're not in Esther, not in Ecclesiastes, and not in the Song of Solomon. But I wouldn't base a serious doctrine on just those 3 books. So those books, yes, they're included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Esther is not. But the others are included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Jews used them, so we scholars include them into the canon of the Old Testament. Other books that don't meet those criteria, we put in the questionable category. We would not put them in a category as being authoritative in the life of a believer. They might be interesting reading. They might actually be true. They might have been written by someone that was motivated by God, but we do not label them as being authoritative as the Word of God because there is some uncertainty. I will briefly mention some books that we find were missing. We know from 2 Chronicles 26:22 that Isaiah, the prophet, was a historian and wrote books of the Bible. Or, well, I don't say books of the Bible, wrote ancient books that we would regard as being true, yet they were not preserved through time. We don't have them. If they were, maybe the Jews would have included them in the Old Testament. Maybe they'd be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then if so, then they too would have been added to the our canon or books of the Bible. But as I said, they were not preserved, and the Jews didn't have them, and therefore we have no evidence. We don't even have a book to offer to put into our common collection of the Bible. There are other books mentioned in the Old Testament that also were not preserved. Book of Numbers 21, 14 through 15, verses 14 through 15 mention the book of the wars of the Lord. That would be Yahweh. We don't have those book of the wars that we know, not that we can recognize or find. So that's not included. In Joshua 10:13, it mentions the book of Jasher, that there's a description of this biblical event, that the sun stopped in the midst of the heavens. Okay, what is the book of Jasher? We don't know. It wasn't preserved. And as John wrote at the end of the book of John, he says, if everything Jesus said were preserved, the world probably could not contain all that Jesus said. So do we need these materials for salvation? No. Are we curious? Well, I get curious about these things, but God did not preserve them. They're not necessary for salvation, so I don't worry about it. I'm just curious. Well, then let's not worry about it and let's not be upset. We just realize, oh, okay, then, oh, well, these books are not there and we don't have them, and so we're not going to lose any sleep over it. Another verse, 2 Samuel 1:17-27, mentions something that was found in the book of Jasher, we mentioned a moment ago. Okay, great, but we don't have it, so we don't know what to do about it. So sometimes you have these books and sometimes you don't. And there are reasons that, they were written, but we live without it. Why? Well, again, they were not preserved. There's also books of the New Testament, the very first book of Paul to the Corinthians. I don't know what you want to call it. First 0.5 Corinthians. That was not preserved. So there's other things that were written, say by Paul and maybe others, that was just not preserved. I'm going to pause there to see if anybody else has a question. You just *6 and unmute yourself and say, hey, Jay, I've got a comment or a question. If not, I think I have time for one more question. Here's a question. How can I believe that the person who wrote or translated the Bible was right? Well, you see, you don't know that person was right exactly. We don't know. But you are asked to be different from Adam and Eve and be a seeker. And you may get a copy of the Bible. You don't know yourself for sure what the Hebrew and Greek text was. You don't know if it was 100%. We do know that there's difficulties in both Hebrew and Greek in ancient times as far as precision. The Hebrew text did not have vowels, so that's a little imprecise. The New Testament Greek did not have blanks between words, so there's a little question from time to time. So there's a little uncertainty, isn't there? And the modern translator, well, he's doing the best he can, but we do not claim that those modern translators were inspired and that God dictated to them. These translators are just seekers like you and I who love God. Well, so we don't honestly know for certain, but you are not judged based on that certainty. What are you judged based on? Do you love God? Do you seek God? Do you love your neighbor? Do you love your neighbor as yourself? And are you contrary to what Adam and Eve are you a seeker to know God's ethics for eternal life, for your benefit, and the benefit of your fellow man? Abraham did not have the whole Bible. He only had a limited communication with God. But what limited communication he had, he trusted. Same with Noah. Limited information about God, but what little information he had, he was a seeker. He trusted. Okay, he probably got some things wrong. But you're not judged on that. You're not judged on what you don't know. You're judged on what you know, how it resonates with your conscience, and what you do with it. and whether you throw it away. If you have access to God's word, but you choose to ignore it, you say, oh, I don't know whether this is exactly right, then you are certainly not a seeker. You're certainly not loving God, a seeker of wanting to love God. You are then like
This session is no longer being recorded.
Okay, that's a good break there. Yeah, we're at a good break time. This phone call, the phone service is interrupted there. So we're going to pause. Good place to pause. And I'm sure Rick will be there any second because our time is up. And we'll bring the system back online, which is good. All right. Pausing the show here.
Oh, well, Jay, we got the telephone line is giving us some trouble here tonight. It goes off every 6 hours. So we're going to bring you right back on. So just stay with us, okay?
All right.
All righty. I mean, that happens. That's what we have here. The telephone line will go off on us. And I wish they went further with it, but it's only like 6 hours. So let's get back on. So we're so glad you're on with us tonight. We got a lot of people that are listening in. They're on YouTube. They're on Facebook. They're listening in.
Welcome
here.
into the live Six Screens conference calls. We thank you for joining in.
Give us
To
a second.
speak up and
we'll
talk,
get this all
press
settled.
star 6 on your telephone. When you are done talking, press star 6 to mute yourself. Remember, when you are unmuted, your phone is a microphone and picks
Just
up
takes
on
a little
all
time to
noises
get
in the
back in here
background.
again, so just wait with us.
We hope you enjoy the programs tonight. You will now be placed into the conference.
If you are the host, press.
Wow, we're glad you're with us tonight. Just hang in.
Yep.
You. There are 5
Okay, we're gonna-
participants in the conference.
All right, let's see what's going on. Jay, we're back on with you. So let me just make sure we're doing the right things here.
Muted. Unmuted.
Okay, you're all set, Jay.
All right. Well, we pretty much wrapped up the last question there is that how can I believe that the person who wrote and translated the Bible is absolutely right? Well, we don't know, but then you are not judged based on whether that translator was absolutely correct and they would not have been inspired. You're judged on what you know and following your conscience with what you know. Are you seeking God? Seeking to love your fellow neighbor? Because the basics are clear and trustworthy in the Bible. So where are you? Are you a seeker? But if you choose to ignore everything, considering that maybe there's a word or two that is imprecise, we don't know, then that is a very dangerous position. You want to be a seeker of God and wanting to love your neighbor as yourself. So that covers that last question that we were asked. The others would take too long. We don't have the time for that. But Rick, if you want to just want to throw out that we may want to consider that in 2 weeks, because of the season, do we want to put this on pause or go ahead? Just let us know.
Yeah, I'll come up with I mean, actually, in 2 weeks, it'll be the 18th, is it? I mean, it's not
Right.
Christmas itself, but
Right.
we'll see what happens. I think we can still do it. I mean, it's close to Christmas, but we're going to do a Christmas special in the 6 screens. But for the time being, I say let's put the pedal to the metal. I say let's go for the 18th. But if something does happen in the meantime, you let me know, okay?
All right, Rick.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jay. We appreciate you coming on today. We really do appreciate your program and all the effort that you put into it. We'll be seeing you guys next Saturday night. We're going to end the program here for Sunday, but we're going to come on next Saturday night, beginning at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, Jay Hess. You're a good man. Don't you ever change. Thank you.